Welcome to Calvin's Stories, where a man who built everything refuses to be erased. Enjoy.
My name is Marcus Calloway. I'm 38 years old, and on the fourth Thursday of last November, I sat at the head of a Thanksgiving table in Savannah, Georgia, with 22 members of my wife's family watching, and I opened a leather portfolio that contained 3 years of my life. Inside that portfolio was the end of a man. Not his death. Nothing so merciful. The end of his story about himself. The end of the version of him that everyone at that table believed they knew. My father-in-law, Garrett Talmadge, had just finished mimicking my 7-year-old son's stutter for the third time that afternoon. He was laughing. The cousins were laughing. My son was looking at his plate. And I was reaching for a leather folder that my wife had given me the day I passed my CPA exam, with words stamped into the cover that Garrett had never bothered to read. I want you to understand something before I go any further. By the time my hand touched that portfolio, the empire he thought he was running had already been quietly dismantled for 6 weeks. He just didn't know yet. Before I take you back to how I got there, I need to ask you for one small thing. If you've ever sat across from someone who insulted your child while you were forced to smile, please hit that subscribe button and leave a single word in the comments below. The city you're listening from. I read them. I read all of them. This is the kind of channel that tells the slow stories, the careful ones, the ones where the person who looked weakest at the start turns out to have been counting the entire time. Welcome back if you've been here before. Welcome in if you're new. What you're about to hear took me 3 years to live and 14 months to document, and I'm going to tell it to you the way I lived it, beat by beat, without skipping the part where I wanted to quit. To understand how I ended up at the head of that table with a leather portfolio in my lap, you have to go back to the first time I ever drove down to Savannah 7 years and 4 months earlier, with a ring in my pocket and a stupid amount of hope in my chest. I grew up in foster care. I won't dwell on that because this isn't that story, but you need it to understand the rest. By the time I aged out of the system at 18, I had lived in 9 different homes. Some were kind, most were neutral, 2 were the kind I don't talk about. What I learned in those years, the only real thing I learned, was that words are cheap and paper is expensive. People will tell you they love you and then send you back. People will say you're like family and then change the locks. The only thing that holds is what gets written down. That's why I became an accountant. Not because I loved numbers, although I do, but because numbers don't lie about what happened. A bank statement doesn't get tired of you. A ledger doesn't decide one Tuesday that it can't keep you anymore. When I met Camille Talmadge in a coffee shop on Peachtree Street, she was 28 years old. She had a small coffee stain on her sleeve, and she asked me what I did for a living without doing that thing people do where their eyes glaze over when you say forensic accounting. She asked follow-up questions. She wanted to know what a forensic accountant actually does. 2 years later, I asked her to marry me on the dock behind her parents' house in Savannah, and her father, Garrett Talmadge, shook my hand on the porch and said, "Well, son, every family needs a man who's good with the books." I thought it was a compliment. I would later learn that for Garrett Talmadge, every sentence had 2 meanings, the one you heard and the one he meant. The Talmadge estate sat on 28 acres outside of Savannah, with a main house, a guest cottage, a private dock on a tidal creek, and behind it all, the source of the family's money. Talmadge Timber Holdings, a third-generation pine and hardwood operation that owned roughly 9,000 acres across 3 Georgia counties. Garrett's father had built the company. Garrett had inherited it. Garrett ran it the way a man runs a small kingdom, with himself on the throne and everyone else arranged in a careful hierarchy beneath him. His son, Whitfield, ran the day-to-day logging. Camille had a quarterly distribution from a family trust. Garrett's wife, Helen, kept the household. And Garrett ran the business, a phrase he used in a tone that made it clear he believed himself to be the only person in the family who did anything real. I noticed the hierarchy on my first Thanksgiving when Garrett seated me at the children's table. I was 31 years old. I had a master's degree. I was engaged to his daughter. There were 8 other adults in the dining room and 1 empty chair beside Camille, and Garrett looked at me with that practiced country club smile and said, "The boy from nowhere needs to learn our traditions first." Camille's face went the color of an old napkin. I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought if I made it small, it would stay small. I sat at the kids' table. I cut a 6-year-old's turkey for her. I told Camille on the drive home that it was fine, really, that her father was just old-fashioned. That was the first lie I told for the sake of a family I wanted so badly that I was willing to swallow glass to keep it. Camille and I got married the following spring. Elijah was born 2 years after that. He was a quiet baby and a watchful toddler, and from the moment he started talking, he stuttered. Not a soft hesitation. A real one, the kind where a word locks in the throat and the eyes go wide with the effort of pushing it loose. We took him to a pediatric specialist when he was 4. Childhood onset fluency disorder, the doctor said. Common, treatable, likely to improve significantly with consistent speech therapy. I remember walking out of that office holding Elijah's hand and feeling nothing but relief, because we had a name for it and a plan for it and a path forward. 3 months later, Camille came home from her mother's house and sat down at the kitchen table and started crying in the way people cry when they've been holding it in across a long drive. Her father had taken her aside in his study. He had told her that the stutter was from my side of the family. He didn't know my side of the family. Nobody did, including me. But he had said it with the certainty of a man delivering a verdict. And he had used a phrase I will carry to my grave. He had said, "bad stock," about my son. About a 4-year-old boy whose worst crime was that his mouth couldn't yet keep up with his mind. I held Camille while she cried. I made her tea. I told her that her father didn't mean it the way it sounded, even though I knew, in the place inside me where the foster kid lives and never sleeps, that he had meant exactly what he said. That night, I lay awake until the windows turned grey, and I told myself, very calmly, that I was going to start paying attention, not reacting, paying attention. I started keeping mental notes, not on the slights, although those piled up. I started keeping notes on the money. Camille received a quarterly distribution from the Talmadge Family Trust, and the amounts had always seemed reasonable to me, but I am a man who reasonable is not enough for. I looked at the company's filings. Talmadge Timber Holdings was a private S-corp, but in Georgia, a timber operation that big leaves a paper trail across multiple agencies, the Forestry Commission, the Department of Revenue, the county tax assessors, in every parcel where they cut. I started, very quietly, pulling public records. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I was just being thorough. The first irregularity I noticed was a quarterly distribution to Camille that was smaller than it should have been, based on the timber sale volumes I could see reported to the Forestry Commission for that quarter. It could have been anything. Inventory adjustment, equipment write-down, 100 legitimate explanations. I noted it and moved on. 3 quarters later, the same pattern. Reported timber volumes high, distributions low. Still could have been 100 things. But forensic instincts work the way smoke alarms work. Once they start, they don't stop until you find the fire. That same fall, Garrett pulled Camille aside at a Sunday lunch and told her that Elijah, who was now 5.5, needed to be pulled from his current school. Savannah Country Day, where he was enrolled in pre-K, was apparently not the right fit. "A Talmadge stuttering at Country Day is an embarrassment," he told her. Not, "let's get him more help." Not, "what can the family do?" An embarrassment. Camille and I talked about it for 3 nights. We kept Elijah where he was. I found a private speech therapist named Marisol who worked out of an office in Buckhead and was, by every measure I could find, the best in the state. Her rate was $250 an hour, twice a week, 52 weeks a year. About $14,000 annually out of pocket. I asked Camille very gently whether the family trust might cover therapy for a Talmage grandchild. She asked her father. Her father said the trust was for real expenses and not for letting some woman teach a boy to talk normal. I paid the $14,000. I paid it the next year too. I paid it the year after that. I never told Garrett I was paying it. I let him believe whatever he wanted to believe about how Elijah was getting better. And every quarter, I kept building a spreadsheet that he had no idea existed. By the time Elijah was 6, I had 14 months of data. The pattern was undeniable. Reported timber sales to the Forestry Commission consistently exceeded the revenue that appeared on the company distributions. The gap was not random, it was structured. It moved through a vendor account that I eventually traced through county business filings to a Delaware LLC called Coastal Pine Logistics, sole member of Record One Wendell Bridges. Garrett's brother-in-law, a man I had met twice at family barbecues and who had never, to my knowledge, set foot on a logging site. Coastal Pine Logistics had no website, no employees on any tax filing I could find, no physical address other than a registered agent service in Wilmington. It was a mailbox with a bank account, and over 14 months I documented $1.3 million in timber revenue that had flowed through that mailbox and not into the family trust that fed Camille's quarterly distributions. $1.3 million that belonged, by every reasonable reading, of the Talmage family trust documents Camille had shown me on our 2nd anniversary, partly to my wife and therefore partly to the household where her son was being raised. The same household where I was paying $14,000 a year out of pocket because Garrett wouldn't let the trust cover speech therapy. My hands didn't shake when I finished the spreadsheet. My hands went very, very still, which, if you know me, is worse. I didn't say anything to Camille, not yet. What I had was a pattern and an inference. What I needed was source documentation, actual bank routing data, actual sale contracts, actual proof that Garrett had directed timber sales through Coastal Pine and pocketed the differential. I couldn't get that from public records. I would need a witness from inside the company, or a subpoena, or both. So I waited, and I kept building, and I tried very hard to be a normal son-in-law at family dinners while a folder on my laptop, password protected and named after a tax code, grew thicker every week. And then, the 2nd week of October, Garrett came to our house in Atlanta for the first time in 2 years, ate the dinner Camille cooked him, and casually asked me over coffee whether I'd be willing to co-sign a personal guarantee on an equipment loan the company was taking out. $2.1 million, just paperwork, he said. Sweetheart, he called Camille, it's just paperwork. I told him I'd be glad to look the documents over. I drove him to his hotel. I came home. I sat at my kitchen table with the loan packet under the lamp, and by the 3rd page, my hands had gone cold. By the 7th page, I understood what I was looking at. The collateral schedule listed equipment that, based on the depreciation schedules I'd built across 14 months, was significantly overvalued. The personal guarantee made the signer, me, jointly and severally, for the full amount in the event of default. And the default triggers were structured in a way that any moderately competent accountant would recognize as a soft trap. If I signed that document and the equipment values came in low on a forced sale and the company defaulted, I would personally owe a bank in Charleston somewhere north of $1.5 million. My body understood before my brain finished the sentence. My hands had gone cold before my brain caught up. That was the night I knew this was not a misunderstanding. This was a hunt, and I was the prey, and the hunter was sitting in a hotel room 2 miles away, sleeping in clean sheets. I told Camille the next morning that I had some concerns about the loan documents and needed a few weeks to review. She told her father. Her father called me directly for the first time in our marriage. He was warm. He was charming. He said, "Marcus, I respect that you're being careful. That's what you do." He said the December 15th signing deadline could probably stretch a little, but not much. He invited us down to Savannah for the 4th of July. He told me, in a voice like syrup, that Elijah was the best part of his year. I hung up and I sat on the back step of our house for an hour, and I made a decision. I was going to give him one more chance to be the grandfather my son deserved. One. If he took it, I would shred the spreadsheet, sign nothing, find a quiet way out, and we would build our lives at a respectful distance from Savannah. If he didn't, I would finish the case. The 4th of July came, 20-some Talmadges and assorted cousins on the lawn. Elijah, 6 years old, ran up to his grandfather with a hot dog in his hand and started to tell him something about a frog he had seen in the creek. He stuttered on the word frog. He stuttered on it twice. Garrett grabbed my son's jaw. He grabbed it with the hand that wasn't holding his bourbon. He tipped Elijah's face up toward his own, and he said, in a voice the cousins could hear, "Spit it out, boy. Talmadges don't mumble." Elijah wet himself. He stood there in front of 9 of his cousins with a dark stain spreading down the front of his little blue shorts, and his lower lip started to shake, and my vision narrowed to a point the size of a dime. I picked my son up. I carried him to the bathroom. I cleaned him. I told him he was perfect. I told him his voice was the best voice in the world. I drove my family home that night without a single word to Garrett Talmadge. And I made the second decision. The case was no longer optional. The case was happening. Camille said it on the drive back. She said, "Marcus, something has to change." She didn't know what I had. She didn't know about the spreadsheet or the Delaware Shell Company or the loan trap or any of it. She just knew that her father had grabbed her son's face and shamed him in front of his cousins. I reached across the console and took her hand. I told her I loved her. I told her I would handle it. I did not tell her how. 3 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and a woman's voice said, "Mr. Calloway, my name is Diane Alcott. I'm the CFO at Talmadge Timber. I'd like to meet you somewhere quiet." We met at a Waffle House off I-95 at the Pooler exit. She was in her early 60s, grey hair cut short, the kind of practical woman who has watched men underestimate her for 40 years and let them. She ordered coffee. She set a small USB drive on the table between us. She looked out the window for a full 10 seconds, and then she looked back at me and she said, "There are 74 transactions on this drive that your wife's father has hidden from the IRS. I've watched him steal from his own family for 9 years. I'm done watching him eat people." I drove home with that USB drive in the cup holder of my car, and I want you to hear this, I almost pulled off at a rest stop and threw it in a dumpster because I knew what it meant to plug it in. I knew that once I saw what was on it, there would be no way back to the life where I was just a son-in-law who got insulted at Christmas. I would become the man who took down Garrett Talmadge, and there is no quiet life for the man who takes down Garrett Talmadge. I drove the drive home. I plugged it in that night after Camille and Elijah went to bed, and the next 6 weeks of my life became something I am still, honestly, processing. The drive contained, as Diane had promised, 74 transactions. Wire transfers from Talmadge Timber operating accounts to Coastal Pine Logistics, with internal memos that referenced consulting fees and logistics services for which no consulting and no logistics had been performed. Cross-referenced against the timber sale volumes I'd already documented, The 74 transactions accounted for the entire $1.3 million gap I had identified, and then some. There was a second pattern I hadn't seen before: falsified insurance claims. Garrett had filed loss claims on timber parcels for storm damage and pine beetle infestation that, according to internal field reports also on the drive, had never actually occurred at the scale claimed. He had collected insurance payouts on losses he had invented. That was federal wire fraud, layered on top of the tax fraud, layered on top of the trust violations against his own daughter. The case file I built over the next 6 weeks ran 340 pages: county land records, bank routing numbers, insurance claim documents with internal field reports attached showing the discrepancy. IRS reportable income that had never been reported. I organized it the way I organize cases for corporate clients: exhibit numbered, source documented, footnoted to the underlying records. The leather portfolio Camille had given me when I passed my CPA exam, with the inscription "For the man who finds the truth in the numbers," sat on my desk holding the executive summary. 12 pages, 1 page per transaction category, each page citing the underlying exhibits in the full file. A board could read it in 20 minutes. A federal prosecutor could read it in 10. And then Diane cancelled our second meeting without explanation, and for 48 hours I sat with the very real possibility that she had been feeding me to Garrett all along. I almost burned the drive, I want you to know that. The night she cancelled, I sat in my office with the USB drive in my hand, and I thought about how easy it would be to just stop, to shred everything, to take Camille and Elijah and move to Charlotte and call it a life. Then Diane texted me at 7:14 in the morning. Her mother had fallen. She had been at the hospital. She apologized. She asked when we could reschedule. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 days, and I kept building. What you don't understand, if you've never had to do this, is how heavy it is to know the truth about someone while you sit across from them at a dinner table and pass the salt. We went to Garrett's birthday party at the end of August. I had, at that point, the full case file in a locked drawer in my home office. I had the 74 transactions. I had the falsified insurance claims. I had the loan trap documented and reviewed by an attorney I had retained quietly in Atlanta, named Howard Reese, who had told me, after reading the personal guarantee language, that in his opinion it constituted potential fraud in the inducement. I had all of it. And I stood on Garrett's back porch with a plastic cup of bourbon I wasn't drinking, and I listened to him tell a story about how he had built the company from nothing. Standing on land his father had bought, telling a story about himself the way men like him tell stories about themselves, where every door he was born walking through becomes a door he kicked open. I smiled. I nodded. I asked the polite follow-up questions. Camille squeezed my hand under the picnic table. She thought I was making peace with him. I was not making peace with him. I was studying him. I was watching the way he held a room. I was noting the rhythm of his pauses, the way he leaned in for the punchline, the way he glanced at his audience to confirm the laugh was coming. I was learning the voice I would have to interrupt at the head of a Thanksgiving table 3 months later. The hardest meal of those 6 weeks was Christmas Eve at the estate. The whole family. Elijah was wearing a small navy blazer that made him look like a tiny banker, and his speech therapy had been going well. Long stretches of fluency, the locked words coming less often. Garrett walked up to him in the front hall, knelt down, and hugged him. A real hug. Long arms, the back of Elijah's head cradled against his shoulder. I watched my father-in-law hug my son with what looked, to anyone in the room who didn't know what I knew, like love. And it was the most frightening thing I had ever seen, because I understood, watching it, that Garrett was capable of that hug and capable of grabbing the same jaw and shaming him in front of cousins, and the gap between those two behaviors was not a contradiction inside him, it was a tool. The hugs were currency. He spent them when he needed to. I watched him over Camille's head, and I thought very clearly, you don't get to do this anymore. Later that night, sitting in the leather chair in his study with a glass of scotch he had poured without asking, he told me, and I want you to hear his exact words because I will hear them until the day I die. He told me, "You should be grateful I let you sit at this table, Marcus. Men like you don't build families. They borrow them." I smiled. I told him I appreciated the perspective. I went upstairs to the guest room and I wrote his sentence down word for word in the notes app on my phone, and I added it to the case file the next morning. 6 months later, in a voicemail Diane forwarded to me from an internal system backup, Garrett would tell his son Whitfield, "Marcus is a good dog. He stays where you feed him." I added that recording to the case file too. I made a note that at the appropriate moment, the two recordings would play back to back. In late September, I filed the whistleblower report with the IRS. I drove to a copy shop in Marietta to print the final exhibits because I didn't want anything on my home printer's memory. I mailed the package certified, return receipt requested, to the IRS whistleblower office in Ogden, Utah. 3 weeks later, the Georgia Department of Revenue opened a parallel state inquiry. Howard Reese, my attorney, filed a formal letter with the Charleston Bank on the equipment loan, flagging the personal guarantee as potentially fraudulent in its inducement and notifying the bank that I would not be signing. I told Camille none of it, not yet. The masquerade had a deadline now, Thanksgiving. 22 Talmadges, the whole extended family, gathered around the long table in the formal dining room at the estate. Garrett would be presiding. He would, based on 7 years of pattern, find a way to mock my son at least once before the pie. I told Camille 3 weeks before that I had something to tell her about her father and that I needed her to hear all of it before Thanksgiving. We sat in our kitchen in Atlanta on a Tuesday night with a pot of coffee between us, and I walked her through the entire case file. 340 pages, 2.5 hours. She didn't cry until the falsified insurance claims, and then she cried for a long time. And then she went very quiet. And then she said, "What do you need me to do?" I told her I needed her not to warn him. I told her I needed her to act normal for 3 weeks. She held my hand across the kitchen table, and she said, "Marcus, I have been acting normal in that house for 34 years. If you've made it this far, do one thing for me, tap subscribe, and in the comments, tell me whether you have ever sat across from a person you loved and known something they didn't know yet. I'll come back to your replies. Now let me take you to the table." The Talmadge dining room on Thanksgiving runs the long way of the house, a single mahogany table that seats 24 if you squeeze, with 2 sideboards along the wall and a chandelier Garrett's grandfather had shipped from Charleston in 1947. The crystals on that chandelier had not been cleaned in 2 years, and I noticed, sitting there waiting for the soup, that the light coming through them broke unevenly across the white tablecloth, throwing small rainbows onto the rim of my water glass. The room smelled of sage and butter, and the particular pine polish Helen used on the sideboards every holiday, a smell I had come to associate with the specific kind of dread that lives in a body when it has been required to perform calm for too long. There were 22 of us that day, Garrett at the head, Helen on his right, Whitfield and his wife and their 3 kids down the long side, Camille beside me and Elijah, freshly 7, in a small chair we had pulled up between us because I was not letting my son sit at the children's table that year. Garrett's brother-in-law Wendell Bridges of Coastal Pine Logistics fame, sat across from me, smiling, eating his cornbread, completely unaware that the LLC he had let Garrett use as a pass-through was about to become the most expensive favour he had ever done for family. The leather portfolio sat on the floor by my left foot. I could feel the corner of it against my ankle through the leather of my dress shoe, a small constant pressure that I had come to think of as a hand on my shoulder. Inside it were 22 single-page summaries, one per adult, plus the laminated executive summary I would read from, plus a small Bluetooth speaker the size of a deck of cards, and the USB drive with the 2 audio recordings queued up. I had practiced this in my home office for 3 nights. I had timed it. From the moment I stood up to the moment Garrett understood what was happening, I needed less than 4 minutes. Once he understood, I needed him not to be able to interrupt. I had rehearsed this silence for 6 months. The first time Garrett mocked Elijah was during the soup. Elijah asked, very politely, if someone could pass the bread. He locked on the B. Garrett, from the head of the table, said, "Bib bread, son, just say it," and chuckled, and a few of the cousins laughed nervously and a few looked at their plates. The youngest girl at the table, 8 years old, looked up at her mother for guidance and did not find any. Camille's hand found my knee under the tablecloth. I covered her hand with mine and squeezed once, which was our signal for not yet. I passed Elijah the breadbasket myself. I made eye contact with him. I gave him a small nod that meant the same thing it had meant for 3 years of speech therapy. "You're doing fine. The bread was warm." He took a piece. He set it on his plate. The second time was during the main course. Elijah was telling his aunt about a book he had read at school, leaning around me with the small earnestness of a 7-year-old who has discovered a thing worth saying. He stuttered on the title. Garrett, without looking up from his turkey, said, "Lord Camille, are you ever going to fix that boy, or are we going to sit through this every holiday?" The table went quiet for about 2 seconds, then resumed. One of the cousins, a teenager I had always liked, set down her fork and did not pick it back up. Helen reached for her wine glass with a motion that was a little too deliberate, the motion of a woman who has spent 4 decades hiding a flinch inside a sip. Camille's hand on my knee again. I squeezed once. Not yet. The third time was during dessert, and the third time was the one I had been waiting for. Elijah was trying to say pumpkin pie because he was 7 and he wanted pie, and the P locked, and Garrett. Garrett pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping on the heart pine floor, leaned toward my son, and did the full mimic, the whole stutter. Pumpkin, with his eyes wide and his head jerking forward, and a kind of grin on his face that was meant to be funny. 2 of the cousins laughed. Helen, his wife, looked away. Elijah's eyes filled, and I stood up. I did not raise my voice, and I have spent 20 years learning to present findings in a calm voice to people who do not want to hear them, and that skill, that one professional skill, is what I brought to the head of that table. I picked up the leather portfolio, I opened it. The smell of the leather rose, warm and familiar, the smell of the day I had passed my CPA exam, and Camille had handed me this same folder in our small first apartment before any of this had names. I took out the stack of single-page summaries, and I walked around the table, and I placed one in front of every adult. The room had gone half quiet, the kind of quiet where forks slow but do not stop, where a few people are still chewing because they don't yet know they shouldn't be. Wendell Bridges, Helen Talmadge, Whitfield Talmadge and his wife, Camille's cousins, the aunts, the uncles. I placed one in front of each of them with the same small movement, the way a dealer places a card. I placed one in front of Garrett last. He looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, which was confusion. He was not used to not knowing what was happening in his own dining room. I returned to my chair. I remained standing. I said, Garrett, before you say anything, I'd like everyone at the table to look at the document I've just handed them. I waited. The chandelier hummed faintly. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator clicked on with that small mechanical sigh that old refrigerators make. 22 adults looked down at 22 pieces of paper. The summary was titled, in plain black type, Talmadge Timber Holdings. Summary of Diverted Revenue, Q1 2021 through Q3 2024. Below the title was a single chart. Below the chart was a single number, $1,312,000. Below that number were 3 bullet points naming Coastal Pine Logistics LLC, Wendell Bridges as sole member of record, and the 74 transaction count with source documents available on request. Wendell Bridges set down his fork. It made a small clean sound against the rim of his plate. The colour left his face from the top down, like a window blind being drawn. He did not look at Garrett, he looked at me. His mouth opened once, the start of a word that did not come, and then closed. Then he pushed his chair back, very slowly, stood up, and walked out of the dining room. He did not say a single word. His napkin slid off his lap and onto the floor, and he did not pick it up. The front door opened. The front door closed. A car started in the driveway. A car drove away. And I hadn't yet said my second sentence. Garrett, at the head of the table, was looking at the page. His jaw was doing something I had never seen it do, a small, repeated motion at the hinge. The skin at his temple, where a small vein had always been visible when he was angry, was pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. He looked up at me and he said, "What is this?" Not a question. A demand. I said, this is a summary of $1.3 million in timber sale revenue that has been routed over the past 3.5 years through a Delaware LLC owned by Wendell with no corresponding services rendered. The full file is 340 pages. It includes bank routing data, internal field reports, insurance claim filings, and audio recordings. I have already filed a whistleblower report with the IRS. The Georgia Department of Revenue opened a parallel inquiry 3 weeks ago. The personal guarantee you asked me to sign in October has been flagged by my attorney as potentially fraudulent in its inducement, and I will not be signing it. The Charleston Bank has been formally notified. I let the silence sit on the table between us. 43 seconds passed before anyone spoke. I counted them because counting is what my body does in moments my body cannot otherwise endure. Garrett stood up. He was a big man, 6'2", 68 years old, and the muscle memory of 3 decades of dominating dining rooms was still there in his shoulders. The chair he pushed back caught on the rug and tipped slightly before settling. He said loudly, "This is slander. This is... Camille, do you know what your husband is doing? Do you know..." His voice did the thing it always did when he was challenged in public, climbing half an octave, hunting for the volume that would make the volume itself an argument. Camille spoke for the first time. She said, "Daddy, I've read the whole file." Her voice was steady. She had practiced too. That was when his face changed. Not collapse, not yet. The first crack. He looked at his daughter, the daughter he had walked down the aisle, the daughter whose distributions he had been quietly skimming for 9 years, and he saw on her face the one thing he had never accounted for. He saw that she had chosen. His mouth opened. His mouth closed. He turned back to me. He said, "You ungrateful you after everything this family has done for you." His pause before the next word was the longest he had ever given me. I let him finish that sentence. I let him exhaust it. And then I reached down into the portfolio and I took out the small speaker and I set it on the table and I pressed play. His own voice came out of it, his voice from Christmas Eve, a year ago in his study, slightly tinny, perfectly clear. "You should be grateful I let you sit at this table, Marcus. Men like you don't build families, they borrow them. A pause. The second recording. His voicemail to Whitfield. Marcus is a good dog. He stays where you feed him. The recording ended. The dining room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in a water glass at the far end of the table. Whitfield, his own son, was staring at his father with the kind of look a man gives a stranger. One of the cousins, the one who had laughed at the soup mimic, had put a hand over her mouth and was not moving it. Garrett tried, then, the playbook. Denial first. Those recordings are doctored. That's not my voice. I said, the metadata is intact and an audio forensics firm in Atlanta has already authenticated both files. The report is in the file. I tapped the portfolio once with 2 fingers. He looked at the tap. Deflection second. Marcus has always been jealous of this family. This is a hit job. He came in here with nothing and now he wants... Helen, his wife of 41 years, said quietly, without looking up, Garrett, sit down. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The sentence landed in the room like a piece of furniture being moved after decades of standing in the same spot. Garrett looked at her, and for the first time at that table, I saw him register the possibility that the people around him were not props. Anger third. He slammed his palm on the table hard enough that the water glasses jumped and one of them tipped, sending a small, clear puddle out across the white tablecloth toward the centerpiece. And he said, "This is my house, this is my table." I said, "It's your table, Garrett, and that's exactly why I chose it." Bargaining fourth. And this was the one that almost made me feel something for him, because he turned to Camille and he said, "Sweetheart, your father loves you. We can fix this. We don't need to. We can talk in the study, just you and me, like we used to, sweetheart." Camille said, "Daddy, you called my son bad stock." You grabbed his face. You made him wet himself in front of his cousins. There is nothing to fix. There is only what happens now. Her voice did not break. I knew, watching her, that she had rehearsed that sentence too, probably in the bathroom mirror of our house in Atlanta, probably more than once, because that is what you do when you have been a daughter for 34 years and you are about to stop being a certain kind of daughter forever. Desperation last. He looked around the table for an ally. He looked at Whitfield. Whitfield looked at his plate. He looked at Helen. Helen was already standing up, gathering plates, walking toward the kitchen as if the only dignified thing left to do was clear the table. The sound of china being stacked was, in that room, the loudest sound in the world. He looked at the cousins. The cousins were reading the summary. One of them was on the second page. 2 others had not looked up from the first. He looked at his brother-in-law's empty chair, where Wendell's napkin still lay on the floor like a small white flag. He looked finally at me. And he said, in a voice I had never heard him use, smaller than his body, "You did this on purpose. You came into this family on purpose." I said, "Garrett, I came into this family because I loved your daughter and I wanted to give my son a grandfather. I built this file because you wouldn't be one." I closed the leather portfolio. The sound of the snap closing was a small, definite sound. I picked up my son. He weighed 48 pounds and he was shaking, not crying, just shaking. And he put his face into the side of my neck, the way he had when he was 3. I took my wife's hand. We left through the front door. We did not say goodbye. The screen door swung shut behind us with the same soft slap it had made every summer for 7 years. The unwinding took 4 months, and it did not require my participation. The Charleston Bank called the equipment loan in January, and because the collateral schedule had been overvalued, Talmadge Timber Holdings was unable to refinance on commercially reasonable terms. The IRS whistleblower file moved faster than these files usually move because Diane Alcott, who had been quietly cooperating with the state since well before she met me at the Waffle House, provided contemporaneous documentation that closed gaps the agents would otherwise have spent a year reconstructing. By March, 2 of the 3 Talmadge timber parcels had been liened by the state of Georgia for unpaid back taxes and penalties, totaling, by Howard Reese's read of the public filings, just over $2.4 million. Wendell Bridges had retained his own attorney inside of 72 hours of walking out of Thanksgiving dinner, and that attorney had, within a month, made it known that Wendell was prepared to cooperate fully with both federal and state investigators in exchange for limited immunity. Whitfield resigned from his position as operations manager and took a job at a competing timber outfit in North Florida. He sent me a single text message the week he left, 3 words long. I didn't know, and I believed him, or I chose to, which at a certain point is the same thing. Helen filed for legal separation in February. She called Camille on a Sunday afternoon, and they spoke for an hour and 17 minutes. And when Camille came out of the bedroom, her eyes were red, but her shoulders were down for the first time in months. The estate went on the market in April. A developer out of Hilton Head bought the 28 acres in May for an amount that, after the liens and the legal fees and the bank's payoff on the equipment loan, left Garrett with less than he had inherited at 30. Garrett moved into the guest cottage on a relative's property outside Macon, the same county where his father had been born. He was not arrested. He was not, in any cinematic sense, destroyed. He was simply, methodically, and completely removed from the throne he had built for himself. By summer, the name Talmadge Timber Holdings no longer appeared on any active business filing in the state of Georgia. The Forestry Commission updated its records in August. The line item where the company had appeared for 41 years was simply blank. We moved to Decatur in February. A small brick house on a quiet street with a covered front porch and a backyard with a pecan tree and a school district where Elijah could enroll in 2nd grade in the middle of the year without anyone knowing his grandfather's name. The pecan tree drops its leaves slowly through October and November, 1 or 2 at a time, and I have come to find that small, steady falling oddly comforting. The first morning in the new house, I stood barefoot in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, waiting for the coffee maker, and I listened to the house. There was no sound, no old beams shifting under the weight of a name, just the small electrical hum of a refrigerator and, somewhere outside, a mourning dove. The leather portfolio went into the bottom drawer of my new desk in the small office off the kitchen. I took everything out of it. The case file went to a fireproof safe. The summaries had served their purpose. The portfolio itself sat in the drawer, empty, the inscription on the inside cover still legible. For the man who finds the truth in the numbers. Camille reads it sometimes when she is looking for tape. She runs her thumb over the letters. She doesn't say anything. We don't need to. It is now late spring. I am sitting on the front porch of our house in Decatur. There is a glass of iced tea on the side table next to me, the condensation pooling around the base and darkening the wood in a small ring, and a paperback I haven't opened. The porch boards under my chair are painted the soft grey of old battleships, and the paint is starting to peel at the edge nearest the steps, and I have made a small mental note to scrape and repaint it this summer, which is the kind of mental note a man gets to make when his hands are no longer full of someone else's lies. Elijah is on the porch swing across from me, reading a chapter book aloud to me because his speech therapist has told us that reading aloud in a low-stress environment is one of the best things he can do. He is on chapter 4. The swing creaks softly on the upstroke. He stutters twice on this page, once on a W and once on an S, and he pushes through both of them without looking up. without flinching, without that small flicker of shame I used to see cross his face whenever the words locked. His therapist told us at his last evaluation that his progress over the past 6 months had accelerated significantly, and that in her clinical experience, fluency outcomes in childhood onset stuttering are strongly correlated with the level of stress in the home environment. She did not need to tell me what she was telling me. I knew. Inside the house, Camille is making dinner. I can hear the small domestic sounds of it through the open window. The cutting board, the running water, a pot lid being set down. She still cries sometimes at night, quietly, in the bathroom, where she thinks I can't hear her. She is grieving the father she thought she had. The man who walked her down the aisle, who taught her to drive on a dirt road behind the timber office when she was 14, who held her hand at her grandmother's funeral. That man existed in some of the moments. He also did all the other things. I cannot make those two truths resolve cleanly for her. I can only sit with her while she works it out. Some math doesn't close to zero. I used to think that if I just worked hard enough and was patient enough and proved myself enough, a family would let me in. I was wrong about that. Families don't let you in because you earn it. Healthy ones welcome you because that's what they do, and unhealthy ones use the promise of admission as a leash. And the difference between the two is visible inside of one Thanksgiving if you're paying attention. I used to think that love and trust were the same thing. I know now that they are different things. You can love someone you cannot trust, and that is one of the most painful sentences in the English language, but it is also a sentence you can build a survivable life around, as long as you stop pretending the two words mean the same thing. I used to think that being good with numbers was a small skill, a pencil pusher's skill, the kind of thing real men dismissed at the dinner table. I know now that the ability to document what actually happened in clean rows and verifiable sources is one of the most powerful tools a quiet person can carry into a room full of loud ones. The chair, as I told you at the start, is not bolted to the floor. If someone in your family uses your child's body or voice or diagnosis as a punchline, that is not tradition. That is target practice. And if you are sitting at a table right now, wondering whether you are allowed to stand up, I am telling you, from the porch of a house I bought with my own name on the deed, that you are allowed. The chair moves. Studies on childhood onset stuttering show that fluency outcomes improve substantially when home stress drops, and surveys of adults raised in high-control family systems find that the majority who eventually set firm limits report being healthier within 2 years. Both of those numbers describe my own house. They might describe yours. That's the story. One leather portfolio inscribed with 12 kind words. One USB drive slid across a Waffle House table by a woman who was done watching. One 7-year-old boy reading a chapter book aloud on a porch swing without looking up. If any piece of this hit close to home for you, if there is a table you are still sitting at and wondering about, please drop a comment and tell me what kept you in your chair or what finally got you up. I read every one. Tap subscribe if you'd like to hear the next slow story. Share this with the person you think